When we end age, then the mind is unshakable. It doesn't wobble or tremble. It is totally still and silent. This unshakable stillness of mind is the meaning of Adhammayada. We think of the mountains as being totally unmovable, but if there's an earthquake, even the Himalayas will shake. But the mind with Adhammayada is totally unshakable. There's nothing in the universe that can shake it. An earthquake can still make the mountains tremble, but nothing can make the mind with Adhammayada tremble. Be totally beyond trembling, quivering, shaking. This is to be outside the thread of the cycles of birth and death. Being born, getting old, dying, getting old, being born, getting old, dying. This is the ordinary way of explaining the cycle of samsara, being born and dying through many, many lives over and over again. But people who are more intelligent can look at it more carefully and see the cycles of the defilement. There's a defilement, and then we act on that defilement, and there's some result from that defilement, from that action, which encourages more defilement, more action, and more results of action. And so between kilesa, kama, vipaka, this vata or cycle goes round and round many times in our life. We can step right out of this vata by ending age. The mind with Adhammayada can't be spun around in these cycles anymore. We can call this closing the door on all states of being, on all states, all existences, all bhava. In traditional Buddhism, they talk about all these different realms of existence, all these existences. We can close the door on all of them by ending age. When there's no age, no self, no ego, how could we exist anywhere? There's no existence. There's no bhava on any of these levels. In Malaysia, you've got all these lists, these charts with the 30, I don't know how many levels of existence. You can slam the door on them all by ending age with Adhammayada. So while you're here, close the door on the bhavas, on the existences, and you won't be troubled by them anymore. And then we can challenge death. We can tell death, come and find me. Try and find me. When there's no pulp, no bhava, no existence, then how can death find us? When there's no ego existing like this or like that on some level, some plane, then how can death even find us? You can laugh right in his face, because death won't be able to see you. So this is to get divorced. To divorce from all the existences. Instead of embracing them passionately, existing in this way or that way, we can divorce them all. Divorce all the things we ought to divorce. Like now, people are always trying to find pleasure in different kinds of existence. Teenagers are running around trying to find fun, get their kicks out of different kinds of existence, sensual and higher forms of existence. The teenagers, the young, are much more interested in the sensual pleasures. As we get older, we don't have the energy for that so much. So older people get more interested in ordinary material pleasures, security, a nice home, and stuff like this, money in the bank. But still, these can be existences which trap our mind and bring suffering. But when the mind has a Dhammayata, when it's still in a state of correctness, when the mind is still in perfection, then it can't get trapped by any of these existences, whether sensual, material, or non-material. A Dhammayata just slams the door. With the Dhammayata, you can understand a young woman could be sitting and a most handsome, debonair, smooth-talking man comes by. And this young woman won't even pay attention to him. His tricks won't have any power over her. Or a young man is sitting and a beauty queen, Miss Universe, comes by. And he doesn't even turn an ear or an eye. Now, not even a herd of beauty queens can disrupt his stillness because of the unshakability of a Dhammayata. These are some of the benefits of ending age. They're really wonderful. We ought to appreciate them. To make this even more clear, in a way that covers everything. To end age, we must end self. We need the knowledge of not self to end self, and then we can end age. To end age, we must end self. The first step is to end age by ending self. The way to end self is to end positive and negative. To end any feeling of positive and negative in the heart. To not feel love or hatred, liking or disliking, delicious or disgusting, pleasant or unpleasant. For our eyes, there are beautiful sights and ugly sights, positive and negative. For the ears, there are sweet and harsh-sounding sounds, positive and negative. Positive and negative smells, tastes, good tastes and bad tastes, soft touches and painful touches, and then pleasant thoughts and unpleasant thoughts. All kinds of positive and negative towards all the sense doors. But when the mind doesn't feel any of these kinds of positive and negative, when we finish all this positive and negative, the mind is, there's no age, no self. To do this, we need wisdom. We need wisdom that clearly sees not self. Then this will cut the floor out from under the experiences of positive and negative. Anatta, seeing not self, includes seeing sunyata, the voidness of everything. Seeing tatthata, the thusness. That things aren't like we thought they were, good and bad, right and wrong, male and female. They're just this thusness of things. That they're neither positive nor negative. If we develop this wisdom, if we learn how to look at things until seeing them according to right wisdom, then there's no positive and negative, no self, no age. For there to be wisdom, there must be bhavana. There must be development. We must develop mindfulness. We need to be able to pay attention, to be mindful, aware of things. We must develop samadhi so the mind can be really firm and concentrate on things deeply. Sati pays attention. Samadhi gathers all the mind's power and energy to look deeply into that thing. And out of this development arises panya, wisdom. If we don't develop the mind, there's no way that wisdom can arise. And so we practice anapanasati, mindfulness with wisdom. Using the breath, we develop very refined and quick mindfulness. The mind learns how to be calm, clear, clean. Then we're able to be mindful of the experiences of life. We'll be able to see things as they are. And we stop taking things as being self. We stop attaching to things as I and mine. When there's this true sati, or mindfulness, it brings the wisdom. And mindfulness and wisdom then don't allow the ignorance of I and mine. When there's this understanding, there's no way that desires, any of the three kinds of desires, can occur. Without the desire, the danha, there's no banha, or problem. No problems means no dukkha. There's no pain. There's no pain in the mind, in the heart. And this is the meaning of nibbana, the end of dukkha. Thus we we get the best thing that human beings ought to get. Have you gotten it yet? End self. To get this best thing, we must end self, which means we must finish feeling positive and negative about things. Which means there must be wisdom. And wisdom means there must be developing mindfulness, must be developing the mind. When we develop the mind properly, develop mindfulness, then we can see things as they really are. This wisdom ends feeling positive and negative about things. Not feeling positive and negative ends the self. This ends all problems. There's no problems, no dukkha, no pain. And then we get the best thing that a human being ought to get. This is something to continually strive for, to keep trying. If you don't get it at the first try, then keep trying. Now we will answer a question that's connected with this. Is ending age a principle of Buddhism or not? Some people have come up to me saying I'm lying, talking about all this age ending has nothing to do with Buddhism. It was even a monk who told me this, that I was totally misrepresenting Buddhism, teaching something outside of Buddhism. In fact, if you do look in the scriptures, you won't find the words ending age or ending or age ending. Don't appear in the Pali. The word to remove all atta and attaniya, to remove all asami mana, all sense of I am, to end all I in mind, all self and things belonging to self. This is all over the place. These words appear all through the Pali. And so when we say this, we can, when this is all through the Pali, we can say to end age, because age only exists because of the ego, the self. Now the words to end, atta and attaniya, these have been repeated so many times that people have lost the meaning. And so we've spiced it up a bit with the words duagu, kongu, or ego and egoing, or ego and migo. This is the central principle of Buddhism, to finish off ego and migo, ego and mygo. And when we end this, then age is ended and one discovers Nibbana. Then there's the question, why do you insist on using these words, end age, or age ending? It just confuses people. They don't know what sense to make out of it. But when they try and pin the blame on me, saying that my words confuse them, the fact is that people were confused to begin with. It's not our words that are confusing them. People have the habit of being confused already. And so as soon as they hear something new, they get confused by it. And so I use the words age, or age ending, because this is directly applicable, directly relevant to our problem of being always confused. Our lives are messed up already, and they're a mess because of age. And so to get right to the heart of the matter, we talk about age ending, to end this mess that we've made. So when we talk about age ending, we mean to end this mess. That's all we mean. To end the mess, the confusion we've made out of age, out of life. When we're tricked by, deceived by age, by ego, then it pulls us in more and more deeply. Because this ego has a certain pleasure to it. It gives us certain kicks, certain joy. This deliciousness of ego pulls us, it attracts us. But for the ego, age is a real pain. It tortures us. The ego wants to have fun, but age draws things out. Time torments us. So if we end age, we can end all this torment that comes from age. Age is something you can see more clearly, more easily than ego. So we speak of ending age because it makes it easier for us all to see the problem. We need to be truly skillful to end age, not just to end it a little bit, to cut it off at the roots, to pull up all the roots of age and be totally finished with it. To end self is to end ego. To end ego is to end self. To end ego and self is to end age. End age and we end ego, we end self. It's all just the same thing. Just different ways of speaking to help us to finally see what the secret is. To see what the essence of what needs to be done is. Now this goes against the feelings, the seeming experience of ordinary people. Ordinary people feel that age is something wonderful. Everybody thinks that the self is the center of their existence. And some of us, when we even hear these words, there's something in us that reacts, that rebels. Some people even get angry. Some people, when we talk about ending self, they think we're being cruel or heartless. They get very upset. This is the way the ordinary mind works. So this word, ending age, can't... The morning talk ended when the electricity went out. This morning we discussed, we mentioned this morning we would consider the matter of age according to the four aspects of the Noble Truth. We talked about what age is this morning. This afternoon we'll talk about the samudaya, or origin, cause of age. Where does it come from? We'll talk about the cause of why there must be age and the cause of why we must end age. Please summon an intention to listen carefully, attentively, that all of us may benefit from this. We spoke at length this morning that age is ego, ego is age. End ego and you end age. Now we must consider what is the cause of there being self. What is the cause of having a self, of having age? What is the necessary foundation for the establishment of something, this thing called, the thing? We'll begin by examining the necessary foundation for self, for the self. Self, or the self, is not something that really exists. It's merely our own stupidity or ignorance, our not knowing, that leads us to believe and think that there is such a thing. When there arises correct knowledge, samavicca, instead of avicca, not knowing, then we see that the self is just an illusion, a trick. You could consider it a kind of ghost, but it's far more than an ordinary ghost, this self, because it tricks us and deceives us much more than any kind of ghost could ever deceive us. And because we let this self deceive us, we suffer. There is pain. Naturally, first there must be some natural experience, instinctual awareness and feeling. And based upon this, there arises the self. For example, the eye sees a shape. Naturally, the eye exists as part of nature. There are forms, shapes. When these two interact, this is still something totally natural. But then, when there is just this natural interaction between I and an object, visual object, ignorance, our own stupidity, sends up the idea that it's ego that sees. Instead of there's just natural seeing of something by the eye, it becomes ego sees, I see. This is where the ghost is born. This terribly deceptive ghost is born right here when when the eye or the ear sees or the ear hears. And then this ghost of ignorance comes up and says, I hear. Or it's natural that the nose receives different kinds of gases, smells. But then this ignorant ghost comes in and we think it's I smell, ego smells. The tongue is the same. The tongue exists, the tastes exist, these are part of nature. But then I taste. I am delicious. I am not delicious. My deliciousness. All these kind of feelings happen naturally because our bodies have a nervous system. Because of the nervous system, there's sensual experience. Some are pleasant, some are unpleasant. This is totally natural. There's nothing special about it. But then ignorance takes it all to be I and mine, to be ego. I see, I hear, I smell, I taste, I touch, I think. With the body, there's the nervous system in our skin, and then different objects come in touch with the skin, and then we take it to be I touch, or I am touched, my touches, my sensations. We should look at this very carefully because the skin, the body's nervous system, especially the sense of touch, is the basis for many problems in this world. A lot of violence is done in this world because we're trying to serve the desires and needs based on our sense of touch, trying to get nice touches, beautiful touches. All kinds of oppressive and ugly, selfish acts are done by humanity for the sake of getting good touches and avoiding painful touches. Especially nowadays where sex dominates the world. Everything, everywhere you go, there's sex. On the TV, the politics, the economics, sex is everywhere. So many of our wars are fought because people, they call it economics, but economics nowadays is just the serving of sensual desires, getting touches that please us. And so we fight within our countries, all the political battles, the military battles between countries, all just because of this sense of touch, when it's taken over by ignorance. And then there's the sixth system of the mental feelings or the mental experiences. Different experiences occur in the mind, thoughts, memories, emotions, moods, whatever you call them. Some feel good, some feel unpleasant. Some are agreeable, some disagreeable. But whatever one of these systems, whether the visual, auditory, olfactory, or mental, get the essence of it, which is that ignorance creates the ego. Ignorance, not nature. Watch this carefully to see that this ego didn't exist from the start. It's created by ego once there is the experience, once there's the seeing, the hearing, the smelling, the touching, the thinking. Once there's the interaction between the inner sense system of the eye with the visual object, or the ear and the sound, the nose and the smell, the tongue and the taste, the body and the touches. When these two pair, when both sides of the pair interact, then there arises sense consciousness. To be mentally conscious of the object. Not just the object impinging on the body, but now there's sense consciousness, and the mind is conscious of this on some level. When there's the eye, the visual object, and eye consciousness, these three together is called phassa, or contact. In this case, eye contact. That means the mind is conscious of seeing something. When the ear and the sound, then there arises ear consciousness. These three is called phassa, ear contact. There's hearing something. Based on the 6 kinds of contact: eye contact, ear, nose contact, tongue contact, body contact, mind contact, there arises feelings, positive and negative feelings. We want to have the positive feelings. We want to get rid of, to destroy the negative feelings. This is called desire, tanha. And out of this tanha, this desire, is born attachment, the sense of I and mine. And out of this is born the ego, the I am. If it's a positive experience, positive desire, there's positive attachment and a positive ego. If it's a negative feeling, negative desire, negative attachment, then there's a negative birth of a negative ego. All of this happens naturally. The philosophers, through their thought, rationalize the ego. But actually this process is just a natural one. Because of ignorance at contact, these things happen. So there's desire, and there's the ego that desires. Once there is desire, ignorance interprets it to be I desire, the desirer. Positive desire and negative desire, it doesn't matter. Out of desire there's the desirer. This is what we call attachment. Whatever kind of desire there's attachment to this desire. And then the ego that desires that way is born. This thing called self begins at what is called upadana, attachment. The sense of, when there is desire, the sense that there must be a desirer. When there is hatred, there must be a hater. When there is love, there must be a lover, a liker, a disliker. This attaching to the desire as I in mind, this we call upadana, or attachment. This is where the ego, the self begins. This is where the self begins. From this attachment, this is like conception. When before there is physical birth, there's physical conception where the sperm fertilizes the egg. Attachment is very much like this. And then there's conception of the self. Attachment is to conceive of the self. And then this self grows. This growing of the self is called bhava, or existence, becoming. The self grows, it becomes, it's like the embryo growing in the mother's womb. But we're talking about something mental now. the sense of self growing in the mind until it's mature. Once this sense of self is mature, it's born as ego. This is called birth, jati. The I am is totally dominant in the mind. Consciousness is then totally centered on this ego. This kind of birth is the birth that arises from attachment. It's not a physical birth from the mother's womb. That's just a metaphor for the mental birth. Physical birth doesn't happen so often, once in a lifetime. But the mental birth can happen many times in a day, thousands, hundreds of thousands of times in a life, if we don't practice Dhamma. So this mental birth can go around and around many, many times. Ego being born many times in many ways until we escape from our ignorance. Because of our great ignorance, because of supreme stupidity, this birth goes on and on and on, over and over again. And it goes on and on without us ever knowing Nibbana. You don't have to wait to die to experience rebirth. You can experience this rebirth of the ego in one day, maybe hundreds, even thousands of times in a month. Tens of thousands, dozens of thousands of times, spinning around in this circle of ego birth and death. And each time this ego is born, there is age. Each time there's this mental birth of me, of mine. When there's me, there will be mine, and then there is age. The physical birth is something totally natural, and it's no problem for us. It happens once, and then our bodies are alive and functioning in this world. But because the way our bodies interact with the world through the nervous system, because we misunderstand that through ignorance, then we're deceived by the whole project. And then we're trapped in these cycles of birth. Many people like to talk about the Buddha's ability to remember past lives. And they generally interpret this to mean past incarnations. No matter how they try to explain it, they're talking about one person who was physically born and physically died many, many times. They call this the recollection of past births. But in fact, this word here, upeni vitsaya jnana, doesn't actually use the word birth. It's the word realms or dwellings. And there's some places in the scriptures where the Buddha makes it very clear when he talks about recollecting past existences. He's not talking about the kind of existence that starts with physical birth and ends with physical death. He's talking about each time we cling to one of the khandhas, to one of the aggregates as I and mine. Remembering past birth is remembering all the past manifestations of ego. Every time the I am was born. But unfortunately, for some reason, the scriptures talk much more about the other kind of rebirth. And so this is the only kind people are interested in. So people aren't interested in getting free of this mental rebirth. The first kind of birth doesn't really keep us spinning around. It's not much of a problem. But it's the second kind of birth, the mental birth of ego. This is the one that causes the real problem. Because even when we're physically born from our mothers, in terms of Dhamma, this is not really called birth. According to the Buddha's way of speaking, physical birth is not birth. Because when the baby is born, it doesn't think, I am born. The newborn infant isn't thinking about birth or I am born. There's no ego, there's no attachment. It's only later, many months later or years, before the ego is born. This is the real meaning of birth. When the mind clings with attachment to birth, that's when the physical birth has meaning and becomes a problem. Only when we cling to it mentally. But nobody talks about this. In the schools, they only teach about physical birth. Even most of the monasteries, they only talk about physical birth and physical death. So nobody studies, nobody pays attention to this mental birth, which is our real problem. There's another kind of birth which is very subtle, which people ignore just the same. When we see something with the eyes, when there is seeing, this is called the birth of the eye, the birth of seeing. When the ear hears, then we say the ear is born. When the nose smells, we say the nose is born. When the tongue tastes, the tongue is born. This is called the birth of the ayatana, of the sense bases. The eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Then there's the birth of feeling, the vedana. And when these feelings are misunderstood, the positive and negative feelings are clung to, and there arises desire, attachment. And then there's the mental birth through attachment of ego. This isn't a problem for the infant. The newborn infant or the infant in its cradle doesn't worry about these things. It sees, it hears, it smells. They're pleasant, unpleasant feelings. Tastes are delicious. Some things taste bad. Some touches are soft and gentle. Others are harsh. But then eventually, because of ignorance, the infant starts to give meaning to all these kinds of experiences. Once it desires some and dislikes others, wants to get rid of other unpleasant ones. Then there's attachment, existence, and then the ego is born. This is when the infant is truly born. The infant is truly born when there is the clinging to ego, when the mind clings to ego with attachment. This is when there is real birth. Before there was just physical birth. But now the ego is born and the infant has age. So thus, the ego, and with it pain, suffering, dukkha, is born out of this dependent origination, the paticca samuppada, of these various conditions. This particular way of discussing dependent origination the one that begins with the eye and the shape. They interact, and there arises eye consciousness. The meeting of the three is eye contact. Dependent on this arises feeling. Dependent on feeling arises desire. Dependent on desire arises attachment. Dependent on attachment arises existence. Dependent on existence arises birth of ego. Dependent on the ego arises old age, death, and all the forms of dukkha. There were times when the Buddha would go off alone and recite this to himself. He would just repeat this, not just saying the words, but of course examining the reality, studying dependent origination. Once he went off studying dependent origination, once he went off and was doing this, and another monk found him and snuck up and was listening. What is the Buddha sitting here, what is the master sitting here saying to himself? The Buddha noticed this monk and called him, and he said, here, take this. And the Buddha taught him this form of dependent origination that begins with the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. He told him to go off, to memorize it, and study it. We call this the humming dependent origination, because we don't mean this as to belittle the Buddha, but it's like he was humming it to himself, the way when you feel calm and you hum to yourself. When the Buddha, he didn't sing songs to himself, he hummed this dependent origination to himself, examining this dependent origination. The same right after his enlightenment, the Buddha studied this dependent origination most of all, in great detail. The first 7 days after the enlightenment, he spent the entire time examining this, seeing the various conditions through which dukkha arises, and seeing the condition through this quenching of various conditions, dukkha quenches. Dukkha arises beginning with ignorance. Due to ignorance there arises the power of concocting, and then onward until dukkha arises. This concocting, this brewing up of dukkha. So it begins with ignorance. When ignorance is just kind of all around. And when the mind isn't careful, ignorance comes in. And due to ignorance, there's the power of concocting. Stay still, the mind that must move, must cook itself up. And this power of concocting goes and digs up the consciousness element, and then consciousness arises. But not pure consciousness, this is consciousness that is concocted by ignorance. When there is consciousness, then body and mind have meaning. The life, what we call body and mind, this integration of body and mind begins to have meaning and function. Before, the mind didn't exist in consciousness now, or body and mind didn't really exist in consciousness, but now it does. Based on this body and mind, this life. Then the senses, the sense systems have meaning. The eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind, the different aspects of the sense, of the nervous system, they function domically. When they're just kind of sitting there dormant, they don't exist. But when they're, through ignorance, concocting, consciousness, and then the living body and mind, then these begin to function. Then there arises contact, feeling, desire, attachment, existence, and birth of ego. This is the long, more complete version of dependent origination. Greater elaboration, beginning with ignorance, which the Buddha was enlightened to. But really this longer version and the shorter version, whether we talk of 8 items or 11, is still basically the same fact, the same reality. How dukkha, pain, is dependently originated due to ignorance. The Buddha taught the longer version to those who could understand it. There's the shorter, more simpler version, which the Buddha taught for ordinary people, because everyone is able to understand this if we study it. This matter of dependent origination, when that monk was overhearing him, the Buddha called him and said, "This is the Ati Brahmacharya, the beginning of the Brahmacharya, the beginning of the sublime life." Our beginning of real Dhamma practice begins with studying dependent origination, examining how it works, how based on seeing there is feeling, desire, attachment, how existence is born, then ego is born. Once there is ego, there is age. Here, when there is attachment, when there is bhava, existence, this is when the mind is regarding things as I and mine. Before they're just natural things, but now the mind, through the power of ignorance and desire, the mind is regarding things as I. This is I. This is me. This is mine. By regarding things in this way, the ego is born. Regarding things as self, the ego is born. Once this ego is born, it claims everything to be its own. Birth is mine. Illness is mine. Age is mine. Death is mine. All the forms of dukkha are mine. Once ego is born, it claims everything as its own, to be me or mine. This is the ignorance of the untrained mind. But if there wasn't any of this ego, there wouldn't be any problems. Life would just flow according to its laws, and we would live within those laws, and there would be no problem. But every time ego is born, we turn it all into a problem, the problem of me and mine. Seeing something, we can't help it, it's I see a shape. Instead of just there's a sound received by the nervous system, it's I hear. Now all these tape players and TVs, they sell very well these days because people attach so much to their sights and sounds. They buy these tape machines, these videos, TVs, and it's my TV. Food, it's not just something. Food isn't just something that the body eats to keep alive. Food is something that I buy through the power of desire. We choose through desire. And then I eat it. The tastes, they're my tastes. Tastes good, it's I taste good. Doesn't taste very good. I taste rotten. When ego gets involved like this, then even food becomes a very sensual matter. It's just another branch of our our out-of-control sex instinct. When ego comes involved, sex gets spread around everywhere. Even food, clothing, everything becomes sensual, sexual. Many people are confused. They think that the self always exists. They think that I exist continuously. But we only have this illusion because we don't examine reality. If we watch carefully, we see that first there must be some experience, some sensual experience of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. This happens first. If there wasn't the senses, there couldn't be the seeing, the hearing, the smelling, the tasting, the touching. But once there's this sense activity, then the feeling, the desire, and the ego can be born. Before the Buddha's time, they taught that there was some essential self, soul, ego, Atman, Atta, somewhere. They taught that this had existed always and would continue to exist. It existed continuously. This was the teaching found in the Upanishads before the Buddha appeared in the world. But the Buddha appeared to teach the opposite. That this illusion, this deceiving ghost of ego didn't exist from the start. This deluding ghost was born later. First there was the seeing, the hearing, the smelling, the feeling, the desiring, the attaching, the being, the birthing. And then this ghost of ego, the ego ghost, is born. When a knife cuts our finger, it's really just the finger is cut. The knife cuts the finger. There is pain. The finger feels pain. The pain is here. But then we attach to it. I am cut. I hurt. My pain. When they give us our paycheck, it's not just the paycheck comes, the hand receives it, we take it to the bank, deposit it. It's not just a natural process. I receive the money, I take it to the bank, I put it in my bank account, I spend it. So really there's just this basic activity of the senses. Seeing, touching, hearing, smelling, tasting, remembering, thinking. Basic natural activities. But because of ignorance, we take it all to be I and mine. And from this ego, we create pain. There's an experience and the mind loves the experience. Through attachment there is love. And then there must be the I love. We can't conceive of there just being love. There must be I love. The ego that loves. And then the love is destroyed. Twisted by ego. In Buddhism, the teaching is always very clear that self doesn't exist. It's just a ghost, an illusion that is born after seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking. When there's any sensual experience that is misunderstood through ignorance, then it's attached to. An ego is born. The idea that the self is eternal, or there is an eternal soul, this is a teaching from other traditions, especially the Hindu tradition. It's totally foreign to Buddhism. Buddhists should never accept such a teaching. In these other teachings, they believe that there's an ego, a self, whatever, Atman, whatever you want to call it, that's inhabiting these bodies And it's this self, in some systems, it's the self that sees, that smells, that hears, that tastes, that thinks. But in various suttas, the Buddha directly forbid some of his disciples to believe this. There were monks who were influenced by the Hindu teaching of the time, the Brahmanic teaching, and they thought that there was some spirit or self that saw, that smelled, that tasted, that heard, that thought, and that this would die, this would go in, when the body died, this would be reborn in another body to continue seeing, hearing, smelling, and all that. The Buddha condemned this monk for turning upside down his teaching and said, don't ever say that that's what the Buddha teaches. That's just the ordinary Hindu teaching. This self that is existing throughout our lifetime and then reborn in many, many lives. This eternal Atma. But in Buddhism, it's all very clear that that self doesn't really exist. It's just a concept, a ghost of our imaginings, of our thought, of ignorance. To end age, we need to understand this process, how the ego is dependently originated, how the ego arises out of these conditions. This is the only way to end age. As long as we think that this self always exists, we'll be trapped in ego and age. But when we see how the ego is born based on the activity of one sense or the other, one of the senses functions, and ego is born upon that. When we really see how this works, we can end age by stopping ego. We should study this as best we can, so that, and then once we understand it, we'll see that we must master the moment of contact. But unfortunately, we don't have the mindfulness to do this. Our mindfulness isn't very quick. We don't know how to pay attention. And so we must train sati, using anapanasati, mindfulness with breathing, so that we've got a fully trained, a well-trained mindfulness. Then we can really pay attention to and master the moments of contact. Every time we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, think, remember, that moment of contact, of sense contact, of experience is mastered. And we don't let the ego arise. But to do this, we need to practice anapanasati, so that we have the necessary mindfulness. Because the baby doesn't have this understanding, it falls into the trap of attachment and ego. When we're born, this is a quote from the Buddha, the newborn infant doesn't know anything about panya vimut, jeta vimut, liberation through the power of mind and liberation through the power of wisdom. The newborn infant doesn't know anything about mental and wisdom liberation. And because of this ignorance, this lack of proper understanding, eventually the infant attaches to the sense activity, to the feelings, and the ego is born. But if we have the mindfulness and wisdom to not let this ignorance dominate the experience, if we experience wisely, mindfully, then nothing can frighten us or startle us. No ego will be born that almost got hit on the head. Just something fell from the tree. It's not me, it's not mine. So we must train our lives carefully so that we can stop this ghost of ego from deceiving us. Have you seen how this ego is tricking us into doing all kinds of stupid and ridiculous things throughout our lives? It tricks us into pain, into suffering, into anguish, torment. Have you seen this? Have you seen how this ghost is born? How it arises? How the atta, the self, and the attaniya, the associated with self, the things of self, how these arise. As soon as there is ego, then there's egoism. Once there's the ego, there arises, we can't help it but be selfish. You can't control the ego once it's born. Even no matter how hard you try, it becomes selfish. As soon as there is this ego, there arises time. There's the time that exists when the ego is born. As long as there is the ego, the egoistic consciousness, there is time. When there is time, there is age. The problem of age arises due to time, which is the time that the ego exists. To get free of this problem of age, then we must understand dependent origination, these conditions through which the ego is born, until we see very clearly that in reality there's no self, that what we take to be a self, this body and mind, this life that we take to be a self, all these experiences that we take to be self, to be I and mine, that really they're not I, not mine. The things are real, the experiences really happen, but all of them are not so. Until we understand this, we'll be tormenting our lives continuously. Until we see that that everything is not self, that there's nothing worth having or getting, we'll always be tormented by desires. As long as we see things as I and mine, as we see them as selves, as atta, then we'll desire things, all the kinds of desire. And then this desire torments us, it keeps us awake at night so we don't sleep properly. It interferes in our work. We can't love properly, we can't work properly because of this desire. So it's important to see how ego arises. When we see this, then we see that ego is not self. The ego isn't real, it's not a real self, it's just an illusion, a ghost. When we see what a fake it is, what a liar, what a trick, when we see how it tricks us, never tricks us for our own benefit. When we see this, then we will realize not self, and this not self frees us from desire. When we were very young, if somebody had taught us this, it would have saved us all the problems we've gone through. But nobody was able to do that. And here we are enmeshed in desire and the illusions of self, always deceiving ourselves, always lying to ourselves. I am, I exist, this is me, this is mine. Until you're able to see that the ego is born after the experience. The ego is added to the experience. Until you see this, you won't understand not self. Many Buddhists memorize not self, but we don't really understand it until we see that ego, that self, comes after the experience, after the feeling, after the desire. But when we see this, we have the wisdom that will set us free. And then there's no problem about future lives, which people are so worried about. People are so worried about their future lives that they neglect their present life. And this is because we haven't even begun to understand the Buddha's teaching. If we worry about future lives, we've totally failed to see that right now there is no self. Right now, we are not self. So how is some future life going to be a problem? If right now I don't exist, if ego is just an illusion now, then it's always going to be an illusion, no matter how many times it's reborn. So why make a problem out of these rebirths, hoping that I get a good rebirth or fearing that I'll get a bad one? I'll be born a dog or a preta or something, a pig. We should see it as just a natural process, that nowhere in this process is there really a self, that it's all not self. You can compare it with a mango. There's a mango tree, and the mango tree has a fruit. This fruit comes from the tree. Is the fruit the same as the tree? And then this fruit falls, or is planted, and it sprouts. Is that sprout the original tree? And then a new tree grows. There's this one tree, the old tree here and the new tree here. How can it be the same self? So to the mango, the example of the mango can help us to see that before the mango tree dies, it leaves a fruit. But the fruit isn't the tree. It's not the self of the tree. And that fruit, not even the fruit, the seed of the fruit grows into another tree. But it's not the same tree. It's never the same tree. It's not some self. There's no continuity. There's just new causes, new conditions arising. If we take it all to be the same self, the same tree, then we misrepresent the Buddha. We insult the Buddha by confusing his teaching. Although the scriptures are full of descriptions of seeing various births or talking about rebirths, this is just one way of talking for certain moral reasons, moral purposes. But the central teaching of the Buddha is that there is not self. So please be very careful about this business of recollecting past lives. Don't turn it into some Hindu teaching, remembering my past lives. In this life I was that, and in that life I was this, and then over there I was that. This is not Buddhism. That all these births, no matter what we might remember or think we remember, it's not all happening to the same self. That each of these births is not the birth of a self. So there's no self that goes from one birth to the other. There's just no way we can say, I was this, I was that. I will be something. This is something imperative for us to study. By studying this properly, this law of dependent origination, then we can truly understand the teaching of not self. So please stick to the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha, when he taught dependent origination, never talked about past and future lives. He just talked about the way we've been discussing it here. These are the Buddha's own words, and you can see them throughout the scriptures. There's no place where the Buddha spoke of dependent origination in terms of past and future lives. There are places where there's talking about recollecting past lives, but it's different places. Don't confuse the two. Many people take, because of their own ego and their egoistic desires, they take rebirth as more important. And so then they let these past lives thinking this dominates the understanding of dependent origination, which is to do injustice to the Buddha. Instead, we should let the understanding of dependent origination just straight from the Buddha's mouth, exactly as the Buddha taught it. We should try to understand that, and let that dominate our understanding of past lives or recollecting past lives. If we misrepresented Buddha's teaching on dependent origination, then everything we think about past lives will be confused, and we do injustice to the Buddha. So please focus your attention on dependent origination, because this is what will free you from the problem of ego. The understanding of past lives won't be anything but nifty knowledge to write books about or practice magic or something. But the knowledge of dependent origination, this will free us from the illusion of ego. This will solve our problem. Just stop that ego, and all your problems dissolve. Then all the problems of time will disappear. When there is ego, time eats the ego. Our egos are bruised and clawed by time. This time that we create out of our own ignorance. But when there is wisdom that comes from understanding dependent origination, then we eat time. Instead of when we're stupid, time eats us. When there is wisdom, we eat time. This is a metaphorical way of speaking, but people just don't understand. When we talk about time eats us, we eat time, people don't know what we're talking about. Study dependent origination, and then you'll see how when we're ignorant, time eats us. Study dependent origination, and you'll see how when there's wisdom, we eat time. We must do this correctly according to the true principles of Buddhism. The principles that genuinely solve our problems. When there's contact, sense contact, feeling arises, then tanha, craving arises, attachment arises, existence arises, birth, there is birth, and then all of our problems, all of our dukkha, our pain is born. But if we want to understand this most completely, we need to back up a little bit to see it all begins with ignorance. That when there is contact, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, that this is only a problem if there's ignorance. When it's ignorant contact, when we see ignorantly, hear ignorantly, smell ignorantly, think ignorantly, then there's ignorant feeling. Desire, which is always ignorant. Tanha is exclusively ignorant. It can never be intelligent. Attachment is thoroughly stupid. You can never be wisely attached. And then existence, the birth of ego, the birth of time, all of this is thoroughly stupid. There's no way you can salvage it. The birth of age. We can't improve this. All we can do is end it. End ignorance. So at contact, there is just seeing, just hearing, just smelling, just tasting. Feeling arises naturally, but it's no longer ignorant. We don't cling to the positive and negative of the feeling. Desire doesn't arise. Attachment doesn't arise. Ego isn't born. There's no time, there's no age, there are no problems. When we study this, we see how things really are. We see the dependent origination of all our experiences, of all our sensations, our thoughts. When we see these as we really are, they really are. None of them are a problem. Nothing in life is a problem. But when we don't see things as they really are, everything becomes a problem. Becomes I and mine, ego and my-go. Once there's ego, then everything becomes my-go. Once there is the ego, it claims everything around it to be mine. Even enemies, my enemies. The ego creates enemies out of its malicious stupidity. There's no enemies in reality. These are just created out of our ignorance, based in ego. Once there is me, there is mine. All of it comes from ignorance. When we don't understand any of this, dukkha, pain, arises. So all of this is points out, if we're able to see, how ignorance creates all human problems. All human problems are rooted in ignorance. Even when we're really trying to be good, trying to do good, doing our best to be good, so that we get drunk on good, intoxicated with good, we go crazy about good. Even being good creates dukkha. When we get so obsessed with good, so drunk on being good, we forget what evil is. And then our being good turns into evil without us even knowing it. Because of ignorance. Because of our own foolishness, we make a big deal out of being good. I am good. And then we're no longer good. We want peace. We fight for peace. We struggle for peace in this world. But we don't understand how things are. And so ego wants peace. But when ego wants peace, ego suffers. Because there's no peace when ego wants. Ego wants peace, but it doesn't have it, so it suffers. And so everything ego does to try and get peace is foolish, and it doesn't work, and so we just create more problems. Ego's desire for peace is selfish. No matter how good it is, it's ultimately selfish. Doesn't mean it's bad, but it's egoistic. And so it will never really bring peace. Because of ego, because of this out-of-control ignorance and desire, we create all kinds of tools, of machinery. We claim that we lie to ourselves that this technology, our tools, are for the sake of humanity. We keep creating these things, claiming these are for the good of humanity. But we're lying to ourselves because it's desire, it's selfishness, which is creating these tools. And even occasionally, if there's some technology developed without selfishness, but once there's the technology, once we have our TVs, our cameras, our telephones, our computers, it's selfishness that uses them. We don't use all this cleverness, this ingenuity to create peace. We use it to take advantage of each other. We use it to get the advantage, to be comfortable. We don't think of others anymore. We think of our own good. Or if we think of others, it's the others that are mine, my friends, my family, my country. So no peace will ever come in this way. All of our strife, all of our conflicts and war come from ego and egoism. Don't deceive yourself into thinking that this will bring peace. All of our struggles to become good, trying to develop ourselves to become good. All of this evolution towards the good. We should take an honest look and see if this has really happened. Or if we've really been just evolving worse. We want to believe that we're evolving better. But look at the forests are disappearing, pollution is growing, There's more and more poverty. We think up better and better tortures. We brainwash our children in more and more sophisticated ways. And we call this getting better. The rich pat themselves on the back how benevolent they are. But most of the time they're just using their wealth, their power, their influence, their good educations to pick the pockets of the poor. They get their educations, they say it's good. But then we use our educations to pick the pockets of the poor and the weak. Our evolution to the good may not turn out to be so good because it's powered by ignorance, by ego. It's an evolution of selfishness. Selfishness growing more and more. We can't just eat ordinary food. We've got to have better food, delicious food, imported food, caviar, champagne. We can't just wear ordinary clothes. They've got to be designer clothes. They've got to be in fashion with fancy name brands attached. Can't just have a good enough car to get us around. We've got to have a nice, fancy, racy car. Our houses have to be big, air-conditioned, nice carpets, expensive furniture, beautiful art. Everything has to be beautiful, wonderful, excellent, the best. The more ignorance there is, the more desire, the more craving, the more ego. So we're never satisfied. There's never enough. Everything's got to be special, marvelous. And so now we live in a society of advertising. We're so trapped in ignorance that we create a whole mechanism to sustain ignorance. Advertising, which is just to deceive us and trick us, to excite desire, to make us believe that we can be happy through desire. That if we just are selfish in a clever enough way, we'll be really happy. We have a whole industry, millions and millions and billions of dollars, baht, francs, marks, yen, just making us drunk on good. All these good things on TV, in the magazines. We see them and we just can't help it. We have to buy them. We get drunk on all these things. They make us crazy. So, all the fools in the world want to be good, and the good becomes a trap. They get drunk on it. And so there's this ignorant ego. You aren't the fool. Ego is the fool. But we listen to the fool and then we become fools. Only interested in getting. Nobody's interested in finding the right way, the way of correctness, the way of doing what is proper. All we're interested in is getting, having, keeping, dreaming. Our economies are based on this. The education systems now, they don't teach giving, sharing. They don't teach us to be correct, to do what's right. We don't even know what's right. Our education systems confuse us more and more, teaching us to be competitive. We have to compete with the Japanese, with the Thais, with the Malaysians, with the Farangs. We have to be selfish to develop the country, to protect our country. So we become slaves to our defilement. The defilements trying to satisfy our desires. We want to get beautiful experiences, see beautiful things, hear wonderful sounds, smell nice aromas, delicious tastes, and we chase after these. We don't get them and we get angry. There's greed. Greed is thwarted and we get angry. We attach to the object of the anger and we hate. rage. We're afraid of not getting what we want. We worry that we'll lose what we've got. Envious of others. All these desires born, or all this defilement born of desire, keep us spinning around in ignorance, in birth of ego. None of us consider, none of us really take a good look. What does it really mean to be a human? What is it that's really sacred, holy, and special about being a human being? Well, we ignore this totally. We don't care. We're totally wrapped up in trying to getting what's going to make us comfortable, happy, beautiful, famous. For example, our leaders, our politicians of all our countries, they say that they're doing things for the good of our countries. Our presidents, our councilmen, our parliamentarians, they say they're doing it all for the good of the country, that they're thinking only for the country. But just about every one of them is rich when they get out of office. And afterwards they charge very expensive fees to give talks. Are they really interested in the good of the country, or just the good of their bank accounts? These are the deceptions of ego. The egos of these